Hey guys, a recent study was published in the New England Journal of Medicine. It assessed whether pharmacologically lowering someone's LDL cholesterol levels to 55 or lower compared to pharmacologically lowering them to just 70 resulted in less cardiovascular events like strokes and heart attacks. The conclusion of the study was that targeting an LDL cholesterol level of 55 or lower resulted in a 33% lower risk of cardiovascular events. But let's look at the numbers. There were about 1,500 people in each group. 147 people in the 70 target group had a cardiovascular event, and only 100 people in the 55 or lower target group had an event. So when comparing people who had an event relative to each other, the amount of people in the 55 target group had a 33% lower rate of event. However, this is relative risks, and to me it's not clinically useful. I don't care about comparing only the number of people who had an event to each other. I want to know if in equal-sized groups of people did lowering the LDL to 55 or lower versus to 70 result in less events. When you analyze the results using the entirety of the people in the study, the absolute risk reduction of getting LDL to 55 or lower is only 3.1%. You can see that reporting things as relative risk of 33% sounds much better than just 3.1%, but 3.1% is the number that really matters. This is just one trick used to make the results seem better than they are. For now, just keep in mind that the absolute risk reduction is only 3.1%. Now, there are a lot of associational studies out there that have looked at LDL cholesterol levels in groups of people to see how different levels in people associated with various health outcomes. These studies have shown that lower levels of LDL cholesterol in people is associated with higher rates of infections, higher rates of cancer, higher rates of plaque in arteries, decreased survival in people with heart failure, increased risk of Parkinson's disease, lower cognitive abilities, higher risk of stroke, and multiple studies show that people with the lowest LDL cholesterol levels have the highest risk of all-cause mortality, which is overall death from anything. Now, those are just associational studies, so we can't say that the lower LDL in those people is what created all the increased risk of all those things. If we wanted to know if the lower LDL was the mechanism behind the increased risk of all those diseases, we would have to know the exact mechanisms behind those diseases and show that lower LDL created those causal mechanisms. But I want to use all those associational studies to make a few points about the new study that showed the 3.1% reduced risk from lowering LDL to 55 compared to 70. The first is that all those associational studies I showed, they found that the LDL cholesterol levels in people who had the lowest risk of all-cause mortality was somewhere between 100 and 150. So my question is, in this new study, why did they only compare levels of LDL of 50 and 70, which most of the time need medication to be achieved? In reality, they only compared using medication to using more medication. Why not also compare the outcomes to groups of people who chose not to medicate and had LDL levels of 100 or 150 or even higher? Could it be because they are trying to make it seem like more medications are the only answer? I don't know. The second thing is that the new study found that pharmacologically lowering LDL cholesterol to 55 or lower was 3.1% better than targeting an LDL of 70. For me personally, 3.1% is pretty unimpressive. It's even more unimpressive when you consider that I just showed you studies that found that the lower someone's LDL is, the more at risk they are for many diseases, and they have a higher risk of dying in general. So my question to you is, do you feel that a 3.1% reduced risk of a cardiovascular event is worth the potential increased risk of getting other diseases or dying in general? I'll leave that for each of you to individually decide for yourself. The third thing is that technically this new study was an interventional study, where an intervention was done to see what result is created as far as risk of cardiovascular events. Interventional studies are said to be higher quality research than associational studies. However, from my perspective, this new study is still just an associational study. All the study found was that lowering LDL cholesterol to 55 or lower with medication was associated with the 3.1% lower risk of cardiovascular events compared to lowering it to 70 with medication. Without knowing specific mechanisms of how this negligible benefit happened, we can't really say that it was the lower LDL that had the effect. It could have been many other things, like some other unknown effect of the medications other than the lowering of LDL, or many of the unknown aspects of physiology we don't even understand. Therefore, we cannot draw the conclusion that lower is better, like many are claiming based on this study. Lastly, the biggest issue with this type of research is that it doesn't help us understand the actual causes of heart disease and cardiovascular events. Heart disease and heart attacks have been linked to all sorts of things like microplastic exposure, insulin resistance, exposure to air pollution, lack of sunlight exposure, exposure to artificial light at night, stressful days of the year, daylight savings, the list goes on and on. Unless we have a theory of heart disease and cardiovascular events that can explain how all those things can contribute to heart disease and events, then we don't have an answer. Studies like this new study that came out don't get us that any closer to that answer. They just result in more drugs being pushed on more people. Considering that more and more medication is used every year and heart disease is still the most prevalent disease worldwide, do we really think that approach is working for us? I don't know. If you want a more comprehensive understanding of what causes heart disease and how to prevent it, check out my Heart Health Mentorship Program. Stay healthy out there.